Susan Manning here today, and she is going to talk to us a little bit more about how to use our MBTI understanding in order to I suppose, identify our preferences and to get ahead in our career. So Susan, I will hand the floor over to you, and thank you so much.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Aoife. Thanks for inviting me. And everyone, you're all very, very welcome. So this is a conversation that I'm really passionate about. I think the more that you can understand your preferences, the more you can understand how you can work to your strengths and recognize your weaknesses, and recognize the opposite of your strengths and your preferences, the more it can help you in your career. But I am very conscious of time. And I probably have far too much detail here, but we will aim to finish at around 5 to 1. And I'm happy to take any questions as you're coming along, as we're going along, or if you want to ask any questions at the end, please don't hesitate to ask me. It is a little bit of an interactive webinar presentation that I'm going to do today. So feel free to either put it into the chat or speak. You're all very welcome. I'm comfortable with either. So the first thing I'm going to just ask everyone to do, if you have a blank piece of paper in front of you, and I appreciate, Shami, you more have a cup of hot chocolate in front of you, but if you do have a blank piece of paper in front of you, to sign your name as you would normally, just write your signature as you would without even thinking about it. And now I'm just going to ask you to swap the pen to your other hand and write your name. And what I imagine is coming up for you is that signing your signature with your preferred hand was very easy, very simple. You do it without thinking. But to do it on your other hand, it took a little bit more thought. You had to think about how you were going to do it. But I imagine that if we looked down at it and if you showed it to us, it was your signature. And if something was to happen to your first hand, there is nothing to stop you signing a document or a check or anything with that hand. And if something awful was to happen to your preferred hand, there is nothing to say that you wouldn't develop a way of writing with your other hand. And that's the key, what I want to highlight to you today. You may have one preference over another, but it doesn't mean that you don't work with both preferences, or indeed that you have been able to develop another preference. And sometimes we've got to be mindful that our preferences are not an excuse. And just because you've identified yourself as being an extrovert or an introvert or a sensing or a feeling, and I'll be going through that terminology with you in a moment, it doesn't mean that either you can't develop the other preference or that the other preference doesn't show up for you in the work situation. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with MBTI, otherwise known as Myers-Briggs, but it is a personality assessment created to help people understand and appreciate differences in personality and perspectives. And I would love that if Aoife was to invite me back another time, and maybe as you became more and more familiar with your own MBTI, the magic isn't only about understanding your own MBTI. The magic is understanding and recognizing the MBTI of the people that you work with. So for example, to get to a stage where you can recognize your manager's MBTI or your team member's MBTI, that's where there's a lot of power in understanding how people show up at work using their preferences. So with MBTI, the tool, which is a self-assessment, it helps you understand how you get your energy. It can help you understand how you take in information, and it informs the way you first make a decision, and finally, how you use your time. And I'm going to be honest and tell you, I was nearly 40 before I realized that the world wasn't viewing the world the same way as I viewed it. It wasn't until I really started to understand about my own preferences and recognizing the preferences that not only that I worked with, not only were the people in my team, but also my family members. And as we're going through this presentation, I have some fun things to tell you about myself and my mom and how different our preferences are. And once I've realized that, how better our relationship has improved. So just before I go any further, is there any questions? Is there anything in the chat box? Aoife, is there something, if anything comes up in the chat box that I miss, you might just point it out to me. But if there's anything before we go on. Okay.
Sorry, Susan, my unmute button wasn't working. Yeah, no, you're good to go. You're good to go. I'll keep an eye. Thanks.
Lovely. Thanks, Aoife. So for those of you who may be familiar with MBTI, you will have seen these letters. And for those of you seeing MBTI for the first time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but basically MBTI is made up of 8 preferences. And when you do your assessment, you're identified with one preference over another in each of these categories. But before we go any further, I'm going to move straight to our next self-assessment. I want you to be thinking about, certainly before maybe before March 2020, when you might have been at an offsite with work, you might have been at a training center with work. And if you were, and you were staying overnight, or even if at the end of the day, how do you like to get some energy? So if I go back to that example, imagine that you're away with work, you've been in a training course, or you've been in meetings all day, and you get back to the hotel and it's around 5 p.m. and dinner's at 6:30. Are you the person who goes up to your room and, you know, has a bit of me time, thinks about a few things? Maybe you go for a jog, maybe you just sit down and watch a bit of TV that is on, or are you the person who says, who's going to the bar? I'll meet you at the bar at 6 o'clock. So just take a moment to think about that for yourself, remembering that neither preference is wrong. In general, and I know that Aoife would know a lot more about the introverted preference than I would, but in general, the extroverted preference is the person that will get their energy from going into the bar and talking to people and downloading about the day, where the introverted person is the person that will spend time on their own, getting their energy back. Now, what is important to remember here is that both the extroverted and the introverted person will go for dinner that night, and both will be full of energy. Both will really enjoy the dinner and the chats and everything, but it's just about how we get our energy. So if you've identified, you know, in general, extroverts, like, they seek out the interactions, right? And they very much enjoy acting and getting straight in with the task, where an introverted person likes that peace and quiet. They need that downtime to think, and you know, they're very much maybe more of a reserved person in their personality and in their enthusiasm. But I'm an introvert and I love a good party. I love meeting up with friends. I love going out to dinner, and I spend all day, every day talking. So it's not, so just because you've identified yourself as an introverted preference, it doesn't mean that you don't like the interaction. It's just that at the end of the day, for me to get my energy back, I need that downtime. I need a bit of peace and quiet, where the extroverted person will like to do that to get their energy back by thinking, by talking. So if you're living with someone at home who is the extroverted preference, could be a child or a partner, they will tell you all about their day from start to finish. They will tell you every single thing that happened, where the introverted person is more quiet. They're both getting their energy back at the end of the day, and remembering that neither preference is right or wrong. So in the work situation, let's think about this, right? extroverts love to shine in front of people, they love verbal communication, and they love networking. But what they need to be aware of is to get ahead. Sometimes they can spend so much time socializing that they actually forget to get their real work done. So if you're somebody who is working in an open plan office, you know that extroverted person, they're the person who's doing all the chatting, and they're getting their energy that way. And but sometimes if they're on your team, they actually forget to do their work. An extroverted person sometimes doesn't stop to listen to everyone in the team. So if you have identified yourself as that extroverted preference, don't forget to pause and say, have I listened to everyone? Because sometimes an extroverted person can really enjoy the talking. And finally, an extroverted person in general doesn't always like the detailed work. They'd much rather to be up on the stage talking to someone. So if you find yourself procrastinating about doing some detailed work, it's a good idea to be mindful if you don't want to avoid that. And then our extroverts, they like the detailed, accurate work, with the deep thinking, and they're the people that will build their deep relationships, but won't necessarily enjoy the networking part. Now, I was working with an introvert recently. Well, actually, it was a couple of months ago, right? And one of the things that was happening to them was that they weren't being heard at meetings, right? So because, again, it was all gone on virtual, it was all gone on remote, that they were finding that by the time that they were comfortable to speak, the conversation had moved on, that they had lost their chance. And this is going to be holding them back, certainly in terms of getting themselves recognized. And they probably had very good thoughts. So if you are the introverted preference, you're going to have to start thinking about how you become more comfortable in talking at interviews when you don't have all of your thoughts clarified, because otherwise it could be a preference that's going to hold you back, because you're not going to get yourself recognized as having great ideas and good thoughts. And finally, if you are identifying yourself as the introverted preference, and you've had a very busy day of meetings and talking to people, you might need to recognize that you are going to feel more tired at the end of the day. So you might want to start thinking about how do you put all your meetings into your calendar, because you want to kind of pace them out. I'm very conscious of time, and I have 3 more preferences to get through, but I am going to pause and just ask if anyone has any questions on that, or if there's anything in the chat.
Nothing in the chat there, Susan. So anybody want to ask any questions at this stage?
I'm sure you've probably, if you've been working with Aoife anyway, you've covered this a lot, extroverted and introverted preferences.
Yeah, but it's great to hear, Susan, and it's great to have a reminder. And I think even just the little things like managing your schedule and just being really mindful of that, because if there are other colleagues who are more extroverted, they might naturally be trying to pack a schedule. And just, I think, understanding our own needs is very important in terms of that. So I think it's all really good. So thank you so much.
Lovely. Thanks, Aoife. So the next self-assessment reflection question is for you to think about, how do you make a flat pack piece of information, a piece of furniture? So are you the person who opens up the box, you get out every nail and every screw, and then you put them all very neatly, and you get out your instructions and you follow it from A to B and B to C and C to D, and at the end of it you have a perfectly built piece of furniture? Or are you the person who comes along and empties out the box? You know what you need to make. It's a table or a chair or whatever that piece of furniture is. You know what it looks like, and you just start making it. In general, both preferences are going to end up with the end result. The difference is the way we approached it and the way we use our information to approach that. So again, in MBTI, the terminology that they use here is sensing and intuition. So a sensing person notices the little things. They notice all of their details. They like to base their facts and their experiences on past experiences, or they rely on facts and past experiences, where your intuition person is very much future focused. They enjoy looking at the wider landscape. They are very comfortable with brainstorming. So again, both preferences play a part in our teams and in our work environment. But if you have the sensing preference and you're being asked to design a 5-year plan, it's good to recognize that you will find this rather difficult. And so for me, again, I am the S, right? And I really thrived in my workplace when I worked with a manager who was the N, because she had great strategic thinking. She would come into the office and she would say, I want us to take all employees to the moon. I worked in HR. And she would have no idea how we were going to get there. She would not know what we were going to do, but she would know that that was the way to do it. I was the S, so I would be able to break down her strategic thinking. I would be able to methodically make a plan and get to the end result. And in this crazy example, get the employees to the moon. Where my manager would not have she wouldn't have the preference to want to break down the plan. She wouldn't have the preference to be thinking of all the small things. So both preferences are right. It's just the way we think about things. So if you've identified yourself as someone who identifies the facts and details that are never missed, you know, that you base your decisions on having all of the facts and you don't like to make decisions without having all those facts, and you focus on the here and now, that's where your sensing is. Now, if you are identified yourself as a sensing and you want to get ahead at work, you're going to have to start thinking about how can you develop that strategic thought process? How can you develop that innovative thinking? How can you be more mindful and recognize when you're only focusing on the details, right? Because as a manager, or if you're somebody who wants to get to the next level, if you only focus on the details, you may hold yourself back. So it's a good idea to be thinking about how do I develop my innovative blue sky, big picture thinking? And finally, how do you, and especially in the workplace, especially when you're working on projects, if they're global projects, if they're projects involving lots of teams, you don't always have all the facts. And that can really be a stress point for a sensing preference. So it's about recognizing that you don't always have to have all the facts to get a place from A to B and move something along. So if you're the intuition preference, you know, you're going to enjoy brainstorming, that's where you're going to thrive. So, you know, ensuring that if you're on a project, that you're at the start of the project when you're coming up with those new ideas. You're going to be very insightful and creative. And again, you're going to be very comfortable with change and you're going to thrive on change. But the intuition preferences often miss the small details. They're not interested in that. They don't usually have any interest or knowledge or understanding. They lose all of their energy very fast if they have to follow through the plans. So be thinking about that, you know, how do you ensure that you don't just get the new ideas and walk away? Sometimes you have to be the person who also comes up with the new ideas and works in getting it through to the final end. As an intuition preference, you know, sometimes when they're making decisions, they forget to include all the facts, right? They forget to include everything. So becoming more focused on the facts when you're making decisions. And again, recognizing when you're becoming frustrated with the process. If the process is too slow, too cumbersome, too red taped, as they sometimes are, the intuition person is going to get like really frustrated and annoyed, and they're going to just like, how can I buy, you know, how can I jump these steps, which isn't always the right way to do. So again, for yourselves, Be thinking about your own teams, and maybe be thinking about your managers, because if you're the person who loves the big ideas, loves thinking about this, and you have me as your manager who's like saying, well, how are we going to do this, and when are we going to do it, and what does it look like, you're going to get really frustrated with me, because you're like, we don't need to worry about those things, let's just get to the end. But it's about how you can get those both preferences working well. I'm going to fly on here. This is one of my favorite self-assessments, right? If you came home after being out and you met your neighbor in the garden and they said to you, oh my God, I've been burgled. What's the first question you ask them? So you've just come home from work, your neighbor says they've been burgled. What's the first question you're going to ask them? So if you ask them, oh my God, have you called the police? Have you called your insurance people? Or are you the person who says, are you okay? Can I help you with anything? Remembering both preferences are right. But if you're the person who said, have you called the police? You're approaching the decision-making with a thinking preference. And if you are the person who said, are you okay? You're approaching the decision-making with a feeling preference. Now, it's really important here to remember the feelings, the thinkers have feelings, and feeling can think. So just because I asked you, have you called the police? It doesn't mean that my follow-up question isn't going to be, are you feeling okay? It just means that when I'm making a decision, I like logic, I like to know the facts, and I'm very, very clear on what is right and what is wrong. Where if I'm the feeling person, I am thinking about what is the right thing to do. You know, what is the empathy that I can have here? I base my decision making on my values and my compassion. And again, just going to fly through this a tiny bit. I am a thinking person, preference. And again, back to when I was working in corporate and I was working with business leaders and we were making a decision about an employee, if they were coming from a feeling preference, often we would find that we had to really kind of get into the details before we came up with the right decision, because I would be very logical and this person would be very much using their values, using their empathy to make the decision. Again, bearing in mind that thinkers have feelings and feelings can think, it's just how you initially approach a decision. Because like your signature that you tried at the start of this webinar, it doesn't mean that you can't come from the other preference. So again, thinkers often are asked for their thoughts because they can be very clear in what the answer is. But sometimes a thinking manager, they don't praise for a good job because they often don't think about that. They don't use empathy at all. And I'm sure you all worked with people who are like, gosh, she never took that person's opinion into account. They just made a decision based on their own logic. And sometimes as a thinker, you've got to be mindful that it's not all about the task. It's about what else is involved. A feeling preference is often someone who's recognized as a really good team player. You know, they enjoy working with team, and they spend a lot of time focusing on the relationship. But again, how does a feeling preference stop us from getting ahead at work? Because sometimes they don't like conflict, and often conflict, and I know Aoife does a lot of work around this as well. Often conflict isn't conflict. It's just having a conversation. It's having the debate. It's varying different viewpoints until you come to a conclusion. So a feeling preference needs to become more aware of that. This might not necessarily be something you don't like. It might be just a way of having a good conversation. a feeling preference needs to learn how to deliver the hard message, especially if you want to get ahead in your career and you want to go up the career track into the management and leading people. And except that sometimes teams do go through conflict until they get to the performing as a high performing team. So the final preference we're going to look at today is to be thinking about what are you doing next weekend. Now I know today's only Tuesday and next weekend is a little bit away, but in general, are you the person who likes to wake up on a Saturday morning and kind of know what you're going to do for the day, even if it's nothing? Do you have an idea of what you're going to be, how you're going to spend that day, whether it's doing absolutely nothing?
In progress.
Or are you the person who likes to...
How are you?
Good. How are you?
And Catherine, do you want to mute yourself there?
For anyone else?
Oh.
Thanks, Catherine. Or are you the person who likes to know exactly what you're going to be doing and when you're going to be doing it? So I mentioned earlier about thinking about your preferences with your team, with your family, as well as the people you work with. So I meet my mother most Saturdays, and I have done for the last 20 years. And I would ask her on a Thursday what we're doing on the Saturday. And as you can imagine, I am the person who likes to know exactly what we're doing, even if it's nothing. And my mom is definitely the person who likes to wake up on Saturday morning and sees where it takes her. And even when I'm with my mother, even if we've made a decision of what we're doing, so for example, we go to the beach a lot to walk. On the way to the beach, my mother could turn around and say, will we climb the mountain? And I'm like, no, we will not climb the mountain. We said we're going to the beach. So again, both preferences are right, but it's how we view the outer world. It's how we see things. And in a work situation, both preferences are key, but depending on where you are can depend on how you approach a project, how you approach your teams. So again, thinking about our judging, if you are the judging preference, it means that you like to be organized and you complete tasks. But there's no organization in today's world that sticks to a schedule. I mean, how many of us wake up every morning with a calendar, and at the end of that day, that calendar has changed between different priorities taking over and different meetings getting cancelled and moved and everything. It's the way of life. So we've got to start, as a judging preference, be thinking about how we can become more preference in terms of being more flexible with our schedule, being more flexible with our plans and schedules. And likewise, as a preference person, maybe you have survived all of your life being very spontaneous and living your way of like that, but now you're leading a team and your team wants to know what is happening with the project. Your team wants the details. So as a preference, you're going to have to become more familiar and develop more of a judging preference to help you organize and complete your tasks. So again, your judging likes to make the plan, they decide logically what needs to be done, and they're a rule follower. But as a preference, you may need to live with that change. Something like for me as well, you know, managing the stress when new information changes things. You know, how do I learn to do that? Because change is inevitable these days, you know, and every day something changes. So how can I manage that internal stress that I sometimes feel with that? And learning to accept that flexibility is a bonus. So perceiving, you know, it's great. You enjoy the flexibility and being spontaneous. You're very good in teams and focusing on the relationship. I think that might be actually wrong point there, but you're very good with dealing with change, right? You enjoy change, and that's great. And that's a great mindset to have in today's world. But what about missing deadlines? How often do you miss a deadline? Or how often are you the person that is working until 5 to the hour to make the deadline. And again, thinking about your team and maybe thinking about your manager. If your manager is like me and you have a plan and we want to know on Wednesday how you're going to make that plan on Friday, and you're the person who is like, today's only Wednesday, like I'm not even thinking about that project till maybe tomorrow or maybe Friday morning, that's going to stress me out as the judging preference, because I am going to be thinking, is he going to get there? Does she have the tools to get that project finished? So again, just thinking about that. And look, I'm very conscious of time, and I could speak about this for a very long time. So Aoife, I'm going to pause it there and ask if there's any questions. And that was a whistle-stop tour of how to use your preference to get ahead.